what we want to do next is that we want to talk about the sacrifice ratio, which is describing the relationship between the inflation rate and the output growth rate. So then what we find in here is that the sacrifice ratio is the ratio describing the changes of the output when the inflation rate is reduced by 1 percentage point. So then how could this sacrifice ratio look like this? The way I look at this sacrifice ratio is that I would like to combine the expectations augmented Phillips curve and the Occam's law. The expectation augmented Phillips curve tells us there exists a negative relationship between the unexpected inflation rate and the cyclical unemployment rate. On the other hand, the Occam's law we learned last semester tells us that when the cyclical unemployment rate got raised, then it will reduce the output growth rate. Because of that, we can link this two theory with the changes in the cyclical unemployment rate, and then we are going to get the positive relationship between the inflation rate and the output growth rate. So in US, this number, the sacrifice ratio, is about 2.39. For Australia, it is about 1. For Japan, it is about 0.93, and for UK, it is about 0.79. And so it tells us that the sacrifice ratio, which is the co-movement of the unexpected inflation rate and the output growth rate, somehow link at a different degree for different countries. For some countries, the sacrifice ratio is higher, and for some countries, the sacrifice ratio is lower. But then it tells us when we are pursuing growth, then at the same time, we need to experience certain level of the inflation. And that is the sacrifice of the output growth. So then the next topic that we want to talk about today is about the Lucas critique. So this critique is suggested by Lucas, who is the Nobel Prize winner in 1995, and he is a very important neoclassical economist. He argues that when we need to develop the economic policies, we need to be aware that the historical relationship between the macroeconomic variables will not necessarily persist once new policy is introduced. That is because when the rule of game got changed, then the relationship will no longer hold between the variables. On the other hand, when we are doing the theory, because when we are developing the theories, we need to make a lot of assumptions. When those assumptions doesn't hold, again, the relationship between the variables again will no longer hold. Therefore, we say that when we are doing or providing the policy recommendations, we need to be aware that we not only need to do the theoretical analysis, the empirical work is of equal importance. A very good example is about the Phillips curve relationship we learned earlier. We said that for Phillips curve, we look at the earlier data in the 1960s, we find out that there exists a negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Then as a policymaker, we may say, hey, we probably can play around with the inflation rate. When we raise the inflation rate, then we are going to reduce the unemployment rate. But then it turned out to be not the case. That is because the true relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate is the unexpected inflation rate and the cyclical unemployment rate. The reason why this relationship held in 1960 is because the natural rate of unemployment and the expected inflation rate remain roughly constant. As time goes by, the rule of game got changed because something happened in the US, as we mentioned earlier. Then this relationship no longer holds, and for sure the government cannot exploit this relationship to reduce the unemployment rate. Okay, therefore, we argue that when we want to provide a policy recommendation to evaluate a policy, it's important to understand that the policy needs to be developed based not only either on empirical analysis but also on economic theories. Both need to work hand in hand for developing a good economic policy. For policymakers, they need to be aware of this locus critique. So now we want to move on to talk about another topic, which is that we want to ask why a lot of time when we are doing macroeconomic analysis, somehow we can have a model without money. So an example for that is the quantity theory that we learned before. We say that for quantity theory, we can derive it based on the equation that the MV is equal Py. M is the quantity of money supplied, V is the velocity of money, the P is the price level, and the Y is the output. We say that when we want to derive the quantity theory of money, we said that the output is in real terms, and it is determined by productivity, by the size of the capital and labor input. Because of that, the changes in the quantity of money supply will only affect the price but not the output. Therefore, we argue that under the classical view, it suggests that the changes in the money supply will not affect the real variable. And therefore, there exists a one-to-one relationship between the quantity of money supplied and the price. So therefore, we have a name for this statement. We say it is called the classical dichotomy. The classical dichotomy is a theoretical separation of real and nominal variables in the classical model, which implies that the nominal variables do not affect the real variable. The real variable is all the variables that measure in units of goods, and the nominal variables is all the variables that measures in terms of money. And it is believed that money will not affect the real performances of the economy. The only thing that the money can act is that it affects the price, but not the real outputs. So that is the classical dichotomy, the theory that separates out the nominal variables and the real variables. And based on that, in our analysis, we can develop a model without money in a lot of the macro research.